Okay, here we go. Hello, everyone. This is Marian Waldman with Teach My Kid to Read. I feel like I've taken a little hiatus from Facebook Live, and I am thrilled today to interview from YouKan Reading, Dr. Cheryl Young and Minna Kangas. And I'm going to introduce them before I interview them and talk a little bit about the wonderful series that they're developing. Dr. Young earned a PhD in General Special Education from the University of Texas at Austin, an MA in Bilingual Special Education from the University of Arizona, and a BS in General Special Education from Southern Connecticut State College. Most of her teaching experience is in the area of learning disabilities and literacy acquisition. She has taught in both the public and private sector within the US and taught at international schools in Egypt, Malaysia, South Africa, Azerbaijan, and Germany. She was previously employed with the Washington State Education Agency as the K-12 reading coordinator and led the Dyslexia Pilot Project. As a tenured track faculty member at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, she taught literacy methods courses and multicultural education at both undergraduate and graduate levels. Dr. Young has presented at national and international conferences. Her passion, however, is teaching kids to read. Now our illustrator, Minna Kangas. Minna Kangas is an artist with a worldwide following. Her work has touched on endangered animal preservation and habitat protection. Minna grew up as a third culture kid, which I think we need to hear about, and has continued her international living as an adult. She was born in Finland and has lived in Tanzania, Libya, Egypt, the US, South Africa, Azerbaijan, and Germany. Her devotion to animals and love of nature are reflected in her illustrations, which we're going to, I'll just show the cover of the book before we even begin so everybody could see these wonderful illustrations that would make anybody happy. So as I typically do with the interviews, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. And the first one I'm going to start with is to Dr. Cheryl Young. And what specifically in your background, in your experiences, led you to this passion, to this this interest and this desire to work with children with learning disabilities?
Hi, Marian, thanks. And thank you so much for having us. So this is very, very great. And I love what you're doing and your Facebook and the work that you do with the library and the librarians and parents and teachers. So we really appreciate that. And thanks so much for having us today. I do, as you read, I have a background in special education. And after I had taught for a few years, I was lucky enough to get a job at Landmark School, which is a private school on the North Shore of Boston. And it is a private school for kids with dyslexia and other learning disabilities. So there I really feel like I learned to teach. And it was high school kids though. So I had this passion about dyslexia and kids learning to read. And we had kids who were 15, 16 years old who came who couldn't read. And it's devastating, but bright, smart, creative, funny kids, students. So that continued my work. So I worked in the area of dyslexia and kind of held on to that passion. And then I know you'll ask that, but I think we'll get to why did I develop children's books. And then I summarily eventually had a job where I worked with elementary students. And there I could see that kids, what happened at the beginning of their school career and how devastated they were when, like, every Thursday or Wednesday, all the kids would go to the library and the teacher would take them, the whole class, they'd go down to the library and the teacher would say, pick a book to read and that's your book that you're gonna read tonight or for the week. And these kids were just devastated. I had one student in particular who was just devastated because he couldn't read, and there were no books really to choose from. I mean, there are picture books, but, and then teachers would lead the young students to these books. And as they aged, you found that they had books that weren't always appropriate. But they just, when they were in first grade and second grade, they just didn't have any. So then I really understood sort of the beginnings and was passionate about writing something so kids could have something to read.
That's great. And it's so glad it's so encouraging to see yourselves and the other decodable book publishers to get more widespread recognition, because it's true. I mean, certainly I lived it, that these poor kids, they're either reading at best sometimes passages or there's nothing that they can take home, or they go to the scholastic school fair. That's always the big heartbreak, and
Yeah.
pretend so it's, you know, it is, there's such a need that at least now seems to be more recognized, and we're slowly getting there. But my next question is actually then, with your work, how did you find yourself teaching in countries all over the world?
I think it was just kind of an itch to go. So they have international schools all around the world, and after World War II, I think a lot of them began to crop up. So there were initially Americans who were overseas, and again after World War II, so there were companies, but also government embassies that would be placed, families that would be placed around the world. And the parents wanted their children to be able to go to school and have an American, at that time, education. And so because they moved around a lot, they couldn't necessarily, the kids wouldn't necessarily learn or be able to learn in that language of the host country. So they developed these international schools. And it was probably in the 80s, really, that the schools started to offer programs for students with learning disabilities. And I was lucky enough to secure a position in Egypt at Cairo American College at the time. So at that time, really, Cairo was one of the very, very few high schools that offered support for high school students with learning disabilities. But you do see it now, and you see a lot of support around the world, and most international schools will provide support for students with dyslexia and learning disabilities, so which is great. But in my career, I've seen that grow, which is nice.
Yes, I'm quite fascinated hearing about it too, especially, you know, knowing even within the U.S. how so many families are looking for options, and sometimes specialized schools are the only way that the children that can get the help they need to learn to read, and not all areas have them. So it really is quite interesting to learn about these programs around the world.
Yeah.
I learned something. And but my next question might refer to you, Minna, and I think it would be relevant to both of you. And it's really, what's different about the approach that you took to your decodable books, which involves the illustration and, of course, the approach with your scope and sequence?
Yeah, so I had, like I said, I had been working with the elementary students, and this one particular student that I remember who just broke my heart. And and also he, even in first grade, was beginning to be angry and frustrated and acting out in school because he couldn't read, and it was just heartbreaking. So I just started to write stories and began to capture. He had a great sense of humor, and thought, that, you know, just a smart kid, had a great sense of humor writing these stories, and I need an illustrator who can capture what I'm thinking, but, you know, I can draw stick people, so barely. So art is not my strength. So anyway, so Minna I knew Minna at that time. She and I were friends. We are
Mhm.
now married, but at that time we were friends, and I knew that she would be able to capture that humor. So I called upon her to do some of those illustrations. So anyway, so we have her, as you had shown,
Yes.
those, and kids just think they're hysterical. So I think that, to me, it's when I work with kids with dyslexia, they're so smart, so creative, so bright, and then and her humor is quite subtle, and I think that they just find it hysterical. So when they look through, it's that opportunity to read, like, yes, I can read, and there's a story, and also to get attached to some of these characters, and then just look for the subtleties in her illustrations.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the, there are a lot of different philosophies on decodables, and I think there is no one size for decodables. There's some that really are pure instruction and are just beautiful in the architecture of the program themselves, and there's some that really are whimsical and more engaging. And I love how at the end you do ask questions, and often people are surprised that you can still use decodables for comprehension. There's still stories, and you do a lovely job of engaging through the story and through these illustrations, and they're a lot of talent, Minna. I could,
Thank you.
I think I'm a little bit attached to the hippo story. It does make, you do start to, you want to read more, and it's, you did a good job with the combination of getting your work across and expressing it. So
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Wonderful. Well, my next question, which we talked about, but I think everybody else is going to want to know a little bit more about it, is I was only familiar with the first series. Tell us more about your work and your approach.
Yeah, so do you mind if I just pull up, I have a slide, so it might be helpful to show the scope and sequence of that. So I'm just gonna share our screen here and pull that up. So let me do that. All right, are you able to see the this
Yes.
slide? Yeah, okay.
I'll double check on.
Okay, great. Yep, so let me move that. So we did, yeah, so we talked about why I would write the decodable books. And I do want to add that I talked about that initial student, and then subsequently I have used these stories over the years, and Minna had originally done them in watercolor. And now with the newer technology and be able to do the more of the graphic depiction in the computer and software programs and Photoshop. Yeah,
I use Photoshop.
so she's able to take the watercolor and move them to be more vivid. So she's able to do that. So we're able to produce them that way. But I do come across students and have, again, who really come to me barely knowing a couple of sounds. And this was one of those students, Heath. And I had started to work with him. He was in first grade. He had also been retained. And when he started to work with me in August, at the end of August, he barely knew a few sounds. He knew some of his letter names, and had a lot of difficulty writing. And it really, he opened up my eyes again. As we teach, I've been teaching for so long, and every student teaches me something. And he taught me again that our stories are still quite challenging for him. So it took us till November to be able to read our first book. And we had to kind of back up a little bit to get to that place. But here and on Amazon.com, there is a video. It's a little bit hard to find in Amazon, but on the page where you can purchase our books, he is there and reading Fig the Pig. So you can see him and then hear just a great progress that he's made. But anyway, that's my story on Heath. So I feel, in addition to Minna's, I think, brilliant illustrations, the scope and sequence closely follows a structured Orton Gillingham-based program. So with that, we know decodable books need to have a high degree of words that are phonetically regular, and where there's a clear sound symbol taught relationship, and the sequence moves slowly, that it is multisensory in terms of that teaching, but that students have been taught those sounds. So, you know, I will read in articles sort of the debate about what decodable text is, but I think the science of reading has identified that and defined that. And you can see in our scope and sequence here that it moves slowly. There are 10 stories here. They're all closed syllables. This is not a program. It's supplemental for reading pleasure. So it's a way that kids can have access to read a chapter book or read a little story, and hold a book in their hand. But they also can be independent in this reading. So at the beginning of each story, and the stories are short, but at the beginning of each story, in this case, Jill gets lost, the students can see the sounds and concepts chart. So have they been taught these consonants so they can check? So for example, with Heath, I'd say, okay, these are the consonants. Do you know the sounds of all these consonants? Yep, all right, great. And you can see J is a new one. So that's a new sound here in this story. All the vowels, they're short vowels by this story. All the short vowels have been taught. These digraphs have been taught. And the letter combinations of QU, and then all is new, and the FLS rule is new. So those are in bold, and then the sight words are identified. And with the stories, if the kids know the sight words, great, but with most OG-based programs, you know, the teacher can supply them or parents can supply them. So just so that you're aware. Some stories might be considered decodable. I find kids do have a hard time with especially Americans, because it's that nasal sound. So an, and all are a little bit difficult. So those are specifically taught later. But anyway, so kids can check, and they can assume independence and have autonomy in their own learning in terms of what they know, what they've been taught, what they're ready to read. So the concepts are also on the back of each book. And teachers, parents, kids can see what those are. And yeah, so I think and then there's the 2 series. And then we are also, we do have 20 stories actually that we've already completed. And our next group or next series that's coming out are the Blugs, which are from another planet. And one of the purposes for the Blugs is not only, of course, for pleasure reading with more closed syllable practice with blends, but the use of nonsense words. So nonsense words, again, I know that there are some people out there that kind of complain about nonsense words, but some of the purposes, it's not nonsense. It's to make sure that students are able to decode those sounds and be able to put it together. So what we did is we took the nonsense words, put them into a story, and these are the Blugs. They're from Planet Greth, and you know, there's Og and Ep and Shill. So there's the kids and the parents, and the kids want a pet, and it's a snick. You know, so they have to sound out the words, but there's some storyline to it.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, one of the things that I often have to do is say, sometimes I've had librarians push back at me and say, oh my gosh, you told me to review these books. They have errors in them. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And they're nonsense words.
Wow.
And same with parents. Sometimes there's not an awareness. I wouldn't have known early on if I had these books for my daughter. I would have thought the same thing. I mean, with you, and it's brilliant that you've woven them in, so they're from another planet. So they that's their language. So it works.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, so we're looking forward to that. So we're working on those, and we hope that they come out by February.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds about
yeah.
right.
Well, that's great. Well, these are, I mean, I'm going to update the website, and I'll be excited to see those books. And this is really, it's always great to hear stories, the stories about the book, and to learn much more uh, in depth about how the book can be used or should be used, and the stories behind them. So the last thing I'm going to ask either of you, Cheryl, you with your experience, Minna, you with illustrations, is what advice do you have for parents and teachers teaching young children to read, either young children or children struggling to read?
Mm-hmm. So, you know, we do have a plethora of information from renowned researchers that have worked on reading, the area of reading, for the past couple of decades. So there, I mean, it's for parents is to keep reading to children, right? So to do that and read to get those authentic literature, if you will. But, you know, people in the field of decodable text or in the field of dyslexia might complain about whole language and what that did and the struggles with that. On the other side, we got some rich literature out of the people who developed whole language, and some of that background and that push back in the 80s in terms of that. So there's so many children's books that are just fun to read and great to read, and parents need to keep doing that. I always listen to parents. So when parents come to me and say, I think my child is struggling and I'm not sure what to do, I always listen. So parents know, and they know when their son or daughter is finding school painful and not wanting to go and having a stomach ache or crying or finding excuses to not go to school, or thinking, you know, they are in first grade and they're not rhyming, or they still mispronounce simple words, or they misspell their name. So those things where, and some of the things that you do to help alert librarians and other parents, teachers, but to continue to get that word out. But parents should know that when they know, they do, and to trust what they know. And I'm really, really happy to see so many people out there that are developing decodable books and texts, and Facebook groups like what you have that's out there and what you do. So to get the message out there, but to keep reading, to find those people, to contact the International Dyslexia Association, you know, online, to look it up, to find out what that is, and then to find those teachers that you trust to be able to get that information. But International Dyslexia is always a good association. So there's a lot of good parent resources out there as well. So there's really good stuff out there, sometimes hard to find, but trust your gut. You know your child, and listen to that.
Yes, well, great advice, and thank you so much. And for anybody watching, you can learn more at YouKanPublishing.com, at teachmykidtoread.org. We have YouKan Publishing listed under the list of decodable publishers, and we'll add the forthcoming series. And for anybody who doesn't know, we also have a Facebook group, Let's Talk Decodable Books and Literacy Resources, and that's a really good forum for educators and parents and librarians and publishers and anyone who wants to learn more about how to help a child learn to read and how to use these resources, and get opinions from people using the different resources for, you know, in different capacities. It's a great welcoming group. I'd encourage you to to check it out. And that concludes this interview, and have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.